All right, so what path should you actually take in order to learn software development in order to get a job, right? That's what we're all here for. We want to learn how to code so that we can get a job because coders get paid a lot of money and they have lots of job security. Even in this economic environment, people are still getting jobs left, right, and center when it comes to being a coder. You just need to know what the right path is to follow, what the right stack is that you need to learn. So what is a stack? Well, first, before I dive into that, you first need to understand, well, who is actually employed right now? This data comes from something called a Stack Overflow survey. Stack Overflow is one of the most popular websites out there. They have the largest survey that they do with software developers every single year. This one is from this year. Most recent data, but really this happens every year. Every year the same data set comes back. So every year the people who are employed professionally and who have real jobs in the real world call themselves full stack developers. Okay, so the biggest chunk of this whole graph is full stack developers. The second largest is a back end developer. So I want to dive into what is full stack and what does back end actually mean, and how does that differ for something like front end, right? We've probably heard of front end before. If not, that's okay. I want to talk about the difference and the pros and the cons here. So I want to talk about full stack development. Again, this is what I refer to as the 5 pillars of full stack development. So if you take this full stack development right here, you can break this blue bar down, which is where all the people are getting jobs. So you can break it down into 5 pillars. The pillars start in the middle with something called server side. Okay, I'm going to be using a lot of buzzwords here, but I want you to know that it's okay if you don't get this right away, right? It's okay if it's a little bit overwhelming, because it is. It's okay if you don't understand certain things yet, because of course not. Why would you understand everything that I'm about to say? This is a very, very high level view of what a full stack developer does. A full stack developer does a lot. So try your best to stick with me. Let's start in the middle. Server side. So what does server side mean? Well, this is essentially a server side language, right? There are a whole bunch of different server-side languages, but I'm going to focus on ones that are the most popular right now. So one example of this is the Java language. You might have heard of Java before. It is a server-side language. This is the antithesis of, or the opposite of, a front-end language, right? Front-end is over here in pillar number 1. So the front end represents when you visit a website, right? When you visit a website, you are presented with the website. You see all the words on the screen, and there's buttons that you can click on and everything. That's all the front end. Well, what happens when you click on a button, right? Let's say you're logging in. You type in your username and your password, and you hit log in. Well, what you see is the front end takes the information you just sent it, and then if you log in correctly, well, then the front end will show you the next page, right? So let's say you're logging into, I don't know, whatever, Instagram or something. You have the login page, you log in, you click the button, and then you get presented with your Instagram page, right? You might see Reels or your, whatever, your feed, you log in. But in between those two pages is something that happened on the server side over here, right? So typically when you click a button on the front end, that you go over here to the server side and something happens, something gets processed, right? The data, your login data, your username and password that came from the front end, your username and password gets processed by the server side, in this case, Java, okay? So that's sort of the start of this whole 5-pillar approach of full stack development. So what is on the front end? Well, typically the front end is made up of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Okay, so JavaScript, some people think that Java and JavaScript are the same thing. No, JavaScript is on the front end. Java is on the server side. Okay, so 2 different pillars, 2 different problems that they solve. Okay, so that's the start of this whole thing. Well, how does the front end actually communicate with the server side, right? When you click a button on the front end, you click a button, that data gets sent over to your server side somehow for processing. Well, what happens? Well, there's a communications layer in the middle, okay, or comms layer. So in the example that we're looking at here when using Java, typically, this is not in all cases, but the most popular technology you hear of is Spring, more specifically Spring Web. Okay, so I'm introducing you to these words because you might hear these words everywhere, right? If you're in the world of Java and web development, you might hear the word Spring a lot, and you might think, well, what is Spring? Where does it fit in? It actually fits into a whole bunch of places, but Spring Web specifically is used for communication between the front end and the server side, right? And when we talk about the communication, we're talking about data. Data flows from the front end through the communications layer to the server side. What data am I talking about? Well, for example, username and password, right? Your username and password, you're submitting it to the server side. Or maybe you are creating something, like you're creating a post, right? So let's say you want to upload something. You have an Instagram post that you want to post. Maybe it's a picture, right? Well, first you have to have the picture on the front end, right? You have a page where you can upload the picture, and then when you're uploading it, it has to go through a communications layer to get to the server side, right? So it's just data flowing from one side to the other, right? And it flows both from the front end to the server side and back from the server side to the front end. So there's a bit of a loop here, and it all goes through the communications layer. All right, so that's three of the 5 pillars. Right now, there's a lot to understand here. There's a lot of buzzwords, there's a lot of technologies, there's a lot of languages and all this stuff. But for all intents and purposes, this is the high-level view. This is as complex as it gets when you're talking about front end to server side. And you can create an app just knowing these 3 things, right? The problem is that you're not able to store data permanently. Okay, this structure with just these 3 pillars does not allow you to save anything. So if you have an app that doesn't need data saved at all, if it just happens, while you're interacting with it and then you're done and you walk away and you don't need it to save anything, this is all that you need. But typically, you want to save data somewhere. So how does that happen? Well, you need a database, right? You need to save the data into the database so that if you try to log in again in the future, it doesn't forget that you exist, right? It remembers that you exist, and it remembers your username. It remembers your password. That's what a database does, okay? And there's a bunch of different types of databases and whatnot. The most popular ones are either one called MySQL or PostgreSQL. These are both SQL databases. They are also known as relational databases. These are all words that really mean the same thing, okay? So that happens a lot in the world of development. You'll hear all these different words, but you find out later that, well, actually 3 of these words really mean the same thing, right? So server-side, you could technically call server-side back-end, right? But back-end arguably is a server-side plus the database. But anyway, I don't want to get into all those nitty-gritty details, but that is the world that you live in, or that we live in the world of software development. Okay, so then there's a database. But believe it or not, the exact same problem we have here, where the front end needs to communicate with the server side through a communications layer, the same thing happens with server-side communicating with the database. Okay, you need to have something in between, another communications layer. Okay, so really, we have 3 main pillars: the front end, the server side, and the database. But in between, we have these 2 communication layers, okay, which are just technologies. They're frameworks that are usually in the language of the server-side language, typically. So in this case, the Spring Web is actually written in the Java language. Okay, so once you know Java, you'll understand a lot of the stuff that happens inside of, in terms of the syntax, in terms of the stuff that you need to write. You'll understand Spring Web. Same with the communications layer. In this example, it's called Hibernate. Okay, it doesn't have to be Hibernate. There's many technologies you can use here, many frameworks that can be used, but Hibernate is one of the most popular ones. Hibernate is written in the Java language. So once you know a server-side language, typically the communication layers are of that same language. Not in every single case, but in a lot of cases, it's the same language, okay? So, cool, here you are. This is called the Java stack, right? This is full stack development, but more specifically, it's a subset of full stack called Java stack. So if you're using Java, these are the most common technologies, frameworks, languages, and everything that are used when you are coding and creating apps with the Java programming language. But this is not the only stack that there is. We call it a stack because you stack them together. You have all 5 of these together that are commonly used together, and that is something you can advertise as you knowing this stuff on your resume. Right? It's like, oh, I know the Java stack. Spring, Hibernate, MySQL, JavaScript, HTML, CSS, whatever. So that's typically the Java stack. Now, what are some other examples of stacks? Because this is where the world starts to feel like it's too big. This is where you start to feel overwhelmed with all these different things. But really, all these different languages and frameworks and everything fit into one of these 5 pillars. One of these 5 pillars of full stack web application development. Because we solve the same problem over and over again, just with different approaches. That's what programming is about. And people have opinions about what language and what stack is best. right? Everyone has opinions. No one is right, no one is wrong. People just have opinions. So another example of a stack is called the MERN stack. MERN uses M for Mongo, which is Mongo database, MongoDB. That's just a different type of database. E stands for Express.js. It's part of the communication layer. R is for React, which is part of the front end, HTML, CSS, React, which is built off of JavaScript, but React is popular. And then N stands for Node, for Node.js. So Node.js is your server side. Okay, you have how do you communicate between front end and server side with Node? Well, typically use Express. Not always, but typically it's popular. On the front end, you use React, which is a subset of JavaScript, right? It's a popular framework for JavaScript or library, whatever terminology you want to use. The database is Mongo, which is not a relational database. It's a different kind of database. But anyway, I don't want to get into those details. And then how do you communicate between Node and Mongo? Typically you use something called Mongoose. Okay, there's also the mean stack. Very similar to MERN is mean. The only difference is you use Angular instead of React. Okay, everything else is largely the same. Well, what other stacks are there? There's also Ruby on Rails, right? Ruby on Rails just means Ruby is your server-side language. Rails is what you use to communicate between the server side and the front end, right? The front end is typically HTML, CSS, and some kind of JavaScript. Okay, JavaScript is very much tied to front end. It appears in the front end often, except for when you're using Node, because Node can be used as a server-side language. Anyway, I don't want to get into those details. But then, it uses MySQL or Postgres for a database, and it has something called Active Record for the communications layer. Okay, any other stacks? What about Python? There's a Python Django stack, right? Python is your server side. Django allows you to communicate between server and front end. Front end is typically HTML, CSS, JavaScript. It uses MySQL or Postgres on the database side, and it uses something called Django ORM in between. ORM is... Anyway, so these are... Again, you hear all these things. You might hear, Python, Node, Express, Django. What else is there? Oh, there's a LAMP stack as well. PHP, Apache, JavaScript, React, Angular. You're hearing all these different things. You're like, oh my gosh, there's too much to hold in my head. But all of these solve the same problem in just a different way. And that might make you be like, well, why? Why do we have all these different things? And it's a good question, right? You don't need them. In my opinion, you don't need to know all of this stuff. No programmer that I've ever met who is a seasoned veteran programmer with, decade and a half or more of experience, none of them know all of this stuff at a deep level because you don't have to, right? You have to know one server-side language at a deep level, in my opinion. Okay, and you need to probably learn JavaScript at a fairly deep level. You don't have to, but I would recommend that you know JavaScript at a deep level. Okay, and then a database, you don't have to go too deep with that because it's not as big of a thing to know when compared to server side. But yeah, you need to learn one server side language and know it very well, and then know JavaScript fairly well. And you can use that knowledge and leverage that knowledge to dominate in any of these stacks, right? In the LAMP stack, in the Python stack, in the Ruby stack, in the mean, the MERN, or a Java stack, or any other stack, in my opinion. Once you know a server-side language deeply, that is where you start. And now I'm going to go back to the start of all my slides here. I'm going to go back to this diagram. That's what I was talking about here is full stack, right? But what about back end? Well, back end is really just understanding the server side, which is pillar 3, and a database, which is pillar 5, right? When you put those two things together, probably with a communication layer in between, so 3, 4, and 5, that really is back end. And a lot of issues I see in the world of learn to code, right? The learn to code world is everyone focuses a lot of their effort and teaching just around front end, right? They just do pillar 1. They just focus here, okay? And they very lightly touch on something in the back end, right? On the server side, let alone actually introducing a database. So I see that a lot, and then I hear people say, I went to a boot camp or I learned front end development and I can't get a job, right? And it's like, well, yeah, no kidding. Only 5.6% of the entire market defines themselves as a front end developer, right? The lion's share of the jobs are in full stack and back end. So why on earth would you be focusing just on front end, right? Start with back end. This, in my opinion, this is the absolute best place to start is starting with a back-end language. And back-end is another word for that is server side. Remember I said you can use the same word to define the same thing, or two different words to define the same thing often. Same thing happens with back-end. But like I said, arguably back-end would include 3, 4, and 5, right? It includes pillars 3, 4, and 5. But really, it could also just be this, right? Because like I said, the lion's share of the learning and the time and the effort and the pain and the suffering and the sleepless nights and the tears and the hopes and the dreams lies right here in the server side, right? And in my opinion, Java is the best one to learn when you're looking at server-side languages. But anyway, that's my opinion. People, of course, have lots of opinions about that. I think it's a great language to learn because it is both popular as well as a little bit difficult to learn, especially once you know this language, the Java language. You can go to any of the other ones. You can go to Node and understand Node. You can go to Ruby and understand Ruby. You can go to Python and understand Python. You can go to PHP and understand PHP, right? That's the power of the Java language, is it's very versatile in giving you a very flexible skill set that you can use to learn any other language, right? Whereas going from something like Python to Java, there's a bit more complexity there. So that's why I prefer teaching Java and learning Java first. But yeah, so common mistake, people just go right to front end, right? And I get it. Front end HTML, CSS is a bit easy to learn. It's fairly easy to learn. JavaScript is where people start to understand, oh, wow, HTML, CSS, I thought were programming languages. They're not. JavaScript is a real programming language. And then they start to get, worried about how complex it is, and they start to doubt themselves and all that stuff. But then you do all this hard work and you learn the front end and realize, oh no, I can't get a job. And remember, what's the whole point? What's the whole point? Let's go back to the beginning. What path should you take to learn software development in order to get a job? If your goal is to get a job, right? Don't learn front end only, right? Because front end only is such a small piece of the market. The big piece is in full stack and back end. So start with the end in mind, start by learning back end, and then translate that back end knowledge into full stack, right? It's it's like, this is the path, this is the way, this is a data-driven approach. This is what makes the most sense. Start with your server-side language, your back end, expand from a server into something like a database, and then bring in the front end, right? And then you can have full stack. And then you are off to the races, my friend.